50 years ago today, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And I've seen article after article be posted in which you have individuals speaking about, oh, have we come anywhere in the U.S. Since that has happened? And racism still exists and various other things. And I'm not disputing what they have to say because I think that's still around, but I don't think it would have ever gone away. You're always going to have someone who has some level of prejudice in their mind. Sometimes that's not even always having to do with race. You have classes and other groups that just think they're better than other people. Not all of them, but there's always some little small segment that's around. But I just thought it was kind of interesting to reflect and to think about the question of if MLK could come back today, would he be satisfied with how things are? And most commenters or commentators that I saw answer that question in the form of an article said no, but it seemed that they were all pointing it at the current state of the government and various enterprises which are not individual. And I think most of his discontent would come with the African American community. Now, anyone who knows about the life of MLK will remember that he came from two-parent home, the South, at a time where there was this religiosity that surrounded his life as he was a pastor or minister rather. Um, and you would know that those views, other than maybe the religion thing, which still somehow manages to survive, um, has basically evaporated from that sector of the U.S. I dare to think what he would think if he knew that the current African American born in this in our modern society is likely to be the child of unwed parents 7 times out of 10. That the average African American, if they are to be met with homicide, is likely going to fall at the hands of another African American 9 times out of 10, and that their shooting, their death, their assassination, their execution will not be featured on the news in any capacity in favor of promoting stories relating to the various, while still important, lesser shootings of African Americans by cops, which again is not lesser because I think it's not something to talk about, but lesser in that it happens much, much less frequently. So, putting those two statistics in place, and look, you have a lot of people who call themselves liberals who will go up here and defend those two statistics and will say, well, this is the case because the war on drugs. This is the case because um, Reagan did something. And my argument has always been that whether or not you say it was a factor, you must concede that there was no single piece of legislation that could be signed by any president or bill that could be introduced by any senator that would cause a woman to spread her legs to a man that had no intent on marrying her. There's nothing that does that where it forces you to have sex with someone and produce children that grow up without a father or grow up without a stable environment. Either case is not ideal, but to blame it on things that the government cannot control, no matter how much you want to say that it does, I think is asinine. And I guess I'm just so tired of trying to think about, all these people I see who will say MLK did this, MLK was great about this. But then you ask them, would he really be satisfied with these current conditions? Would these things appeal to him? Would he come back and say, oh, I have a smile on my face because I've seen the current states of the African American and I'm very happy? He wouldn't be content with that. And it drives me crazy to read these articles and they pretend as if you can blame the bad things that happen to communities in mass on legislation when if this were 50, 60 years ago, that would have been a legitimate argument. Let me say hello to C Lab Beach. I think about Jim Crow era and, signs with whites only, stories of, African Americans having to sit in the balconies of movie theaters. And you go to this current era, and that's not even the case anymore. But yet you still find people who are trying to tell you that they have somehow been screwed over, um, based off of their happening to be of a certain race that, yes, some people will not like on the premise of them being that race, but try to disqualify any wrongs that have been done to them by members of their own group, um, through blaming the government. Which, to give you an example, let's say there's someone who, is upset with the fact that they were born to two single parents. A person who's upset with that but wants to move on is going to say, well, that's a fact of my life. Let me go get a job or go to school or do something that is going to better me in the conventional sense. Um, a person who is upset with this in what I would consider an irrational way will say, well, the war on drugs with President Reagan forced the crack epidemic into the African American community, and so as a result, my mother had no choice but to open her. They'll do that, and these are things that typically unnerve me. And I guess what it's really come down to is seeing degradation year after year, and then a lot of these same people who are perpetuating a system that we can believe based off of multiple statistics. We know the higher rates of just undesirable fates for those that don't come from a two-parent household. Does that mean everyone is going to meet that same fate? No, but it more often than not happens to someone with that circumstance. It is what it is. Um, they will sit here and try to blame everything else. And King didn't do that, is what is so frustrating. And in the times where he said, yes, this governor, is saying these awful things, this politician is doing this, he actually tried to work with legislators. You look at many of these groups now where they're trying to condemn all Caucasians or completely broaden their hatred to describe an entire group just because they happen to share the race as whoever is currently in power, even if they themselves, individuals, don't hold the power, i.e., the average white person in the U.S., they still get persecuted over happening to be the same race as someone that historically did something that they had no control over by virtue, again, of something they couldn't control. But then if you bring this up and you tell a group that, yes, in this era you need to do things that are allotted to you, um, by the government, by advancements made by people before you get criticized. You get called terms that, along the lines of Uncle Tom and various other hateful words that are designed to make you want to just not say anything. Okay, and then C Lab says, just work hard and you'll get there. You want to go in life. I hate when people say it's because of race. It's you as to make a choice to make a better life for yourself. A Zirexo says, how's it going? Let's say hello back to him slash her. I'm not sure. So I'm greeting both of you. Um, so I did dread on making this stream because I actually wanted to write out some remarks and say, oh, this statistic proves that this didn't happen. But I don't put any of that on King's footstep. I think one of the worst parts about his death was that he wasn't able to capitalize on those advancements. We're talking about someone who died only, what, 3, 4 years after the Civil Rights Act of '64 was signed. The Voting Rights Act, what, 3 years later? Gone. And you had someone who theoretically, if this war on drugs was so devastating, could have gone up against it during the Nixon administration, which he wasn't able to live to see as a result of his untimely demise. Now, you also have to question, well, who in the leadership at that point should have been able to adequately take over and control things and, move it in a direction that would be similar to the one he espoused. But you have this over reliance on the Democrats by these minority groups. Okay, as Rexo says, do you think MLK would be on the right or left today? I'm going with the left just because it seems all of the black leaders who were from that time period that managed to survive into subsequent decades and just stick around post that period always support the Democrats, um, which I'm not telling them go jump to the Republic. And I guess what I don't like about that question is that it feels more likely he would be a neutral figure who would say, don't stick with this one party. Or if you vote for them, actually hold them to their word over how things are going. I think he would probably be right in there with the rest of many of these civil rights era figures who are denouncing Trump and talking about the continued application of racism in the U.S. But I don't think he would fully give into giving Democrats endorsements and pat on the backs and saying that they're the allies of the community. I think he would probably accuse them of just trying to get votes in their current capacity. I don't believe they could play the same tricks on him that they've been able to do on many of the current era people who are so dismayed with Republicans that they think if they just flock in large enough numbers to the other party, it's going to make a difference. Um, my issue has always been that they. Okay, so C Lab says left, but not as far. Yeah, my issue has always been that we focus so much on these presidential elections that whenever there's a statewide one, we don't seem to really apply the same level of just contempt or otherwise focus, for a better term. For example, when you had the Alabama special election where all those African Americans, their high turnout propelled the Democrat Doug Jones to victory, and he started to kind of rescind on some of the wishes that they had, which were to have African Americans in positions within his staff. Months later, you don't see them lining up against by his office to complain about that. They were just happy a Democrat won. Um, and the only way I can be satisfied with their performance in that state is if they don't show up for him again after 2 years of doing nothing for them. As Rexo says, if only white men voted in the last election and Trump would have carried nearly every state. All right. I don't know what to say to that. So, that's a view you can have, and I'm not against it or the possibility of that having happened. Although we'll never have the definitive answer. So I don't want to make this stream go on forever. I just really was wanted to commemorate the anniversary. I think MLK was an inspirational leader um, who was taken too quickly and opened the doors for African Americans to succeed and prosper in subsequent decades, but they were crippled by a lack of leadership and not having a direct measure to state a task. You didn't have people that were going into those inner city communities and saying, hey, instead of having sex without any form of protection and having these children that you're not ready to take care of, why don't you go to school first or get a job that is, sustainable to your type of living? Why don't you move out of this neighborhood with these people that are willing to, blow someone to death over looking at them before you decide to have children here? These are things that just should have been thought of and asked amongst each other in these last 50 years since his death that are not his fault, but are the fault of subsequent generations. And that everyone, follow because a lot of times when I say things of this nature, they're like, oh, you're condemning the whole African American community. No, no, no. That 7 out of 10 thing still means there's 3 out of 10 that have, you know, um, the forethought to get married before they have any children. And for all I know, some of those could have been, oh, I just unintentionally got pregnant. Let's get married. There's a 9 month interim, uh, and that murder rate. I don't even know how to defend that or to not. But there's enough that are not doing that to each other to say that the decent ones are still around. You just have to pick through and look in there. And sometimes you come in contact with those who are not so decent, who are perpetuating, um, those numbers. And look, having a child that's not what that you're not married to the parent of doesn't mean you're some despicable person, but it does mean there are certain problems that statistically are more likely to arise. And I guess as a person who's aware of these things, I've tried to rectify it in my own personal life. Better or worse at the time of MLK's death? I would say he was making things better, and I would say that we're worse in the decades afterward. And you have to remember the discrimination of then, where you had those signs and those various regulations on race with segregation, and it now, you just can't make a comparison. I've actually read I read one book about a year ago by this former officer, who was talking about, reforming law enforcement. And there was a line in that novel, it was something that was similar to this, that racism is as bad or worse than it was decades ago. When I read that line, I closed that book. I closed it. I came back to. I read some various excerpts of it, and by the end of reading that entire thing for that class I had it in, I was not impressed. I was disgusted that this teacher had mandated me to go and read this material, and I was disturbed that someone who was that old would say something like that. And that's a view that's different from mine, but it was just so absurd to me, and it still does kind of feel bizarre to hear that. Yes, it's racism, discrimination are both around, but to suggest that it's to the extent of back then when hoses were being applied, Bull Connor, are you kidding me? So it's just my opinion. I'll have something else out tomorrow. Are you as optimistic as the civil rights leaders were at that time about the future? Oh, no, no, I think it will get worse. Because remember, at that point, you were actually seeing laws being signed, and you had a high marriage rate, and you didn't have the, large mass incarceration of blacks that have been going on for the last couple of decades now. See, unlike them, I don't have much to look forward to based off of what I'm currently seeing. Um, whether it's the 9 times out of 10 onslaught of homicides that are black on black crime, or the liberals who know it's bad, who defend it nonetheless. I've seen so many figures I respect, admire, try to stick up for that, and there is no defense, in my opinion. Obviously, they're entitled to their own opinion, but it's just my perspective that things will get worse. Some of us are going to live to be 100 years old, and they will still be doing the same things as they did in 2018 and in the decades leading up to this year. So I think I am seeing the beginning of the continued gradual decline. There's a reason that in that 2050 statistic prediction, we go down in terms of the U.S. population by a whole percentage point. We spend too much time murdering each other in the streets over petty things. Um, and the ones of us who do manage to survive, who aren't part of the indoctrinated system of I have to act hard to impress some woman or something else, are left for the scraps, aren't allowed to reproduce because the women don't like us. That whole thing of this person that is aggressive and confrontational is attractive, when that person more often than not ends up either incarcerated or being met by an early grave as a result of a conflict with a person who has the same ethnicity as them. And I've fallen into the other category of not being, wanted by my female contemporaries. So I just shrug my shoulders and say, okay, we'll let the degradation continue. And, in my own life, I've tried to rectify it, but if they're not willing to participate in reforming how things are, and seeing things long term, 10, 20, 30 years from now, and there's nothing else I can do. So, uh, as I said before in other installments and streams with Serenity's Prayer, let me say hello to you, to your username. Um, as I said before in other installments on this channel and streams, I take a lot of advice from this one line in Serenity's Prayer or Serenity Prayer. Help me to accept the things I cannot change. And that includes the mindset of the group of people who have caused for those very poor and abysmal statistics to be a thing. No piece of legislation and no law causes nine times out of 10 when an African American is murdered to be the result of him coming into conflict with someone of his own ethnicity, his or her own ethnicity. And no piece of legislation makes women open their legs to men that have no intent on marrying them. These are things you just can't deny. And I don't think MLK would. MLK would, and as a result, I don't believe he would be satisfied with how things are. So thank you for watching. Have a good day.